special today. We also have a gentleman called Thomas Lake Harris who will be joining us. Some people say Thomas Lake Harris died in 1906, or did he? Back today, we have, and working on his reputation, Thomas Lake Harris. Bill, come on up.
Well, thank you very much. And I am Thomas Lake Harris, the Bill Montgomery. This is his body, but I mastered in 1891 the art of human resuscitation. So I am able to come and occupy a body that I please at any time. They say I died in 1906. My followers at that point thought I was dead. They told everybody else I was just sleeping. But after about 3 weeks or 3 months rather, they decided they had to do something. So they did put me away, but I come back regularly at this point. So I'm here to talk to you today about utopia. How many people want to go to utopia? How many people are living in utopia? Are people living in utopia here? Okay. So I should mention that when you address me, you can use several means of address. I ask to be called either father, pivot, primate, or king. So just please use any of those titles if you would, please. That's for my followers. And today I will be open to acquiring new followers if anyone wants to follow the rules of the Brotherhood of New Life, which was my group. So pay attention. You may want to join us. Perhaps you may want to join us. Now, let me talk about utopia just in general for a while. Back in my day, back in the mid 1800s, people were into spiritualism heavily, and utopia was a goal of many, many people. So there were many utopian communities. So you probably mean what you probably mean. You probably want to know what utopia means, where it come from. 1516, Sir Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia. And he looked in the Greek language, and he discovered that if you put certain words together, you come up with the word utopia, which basically means, anybody know what utopia means in Greek? It means no place, unfortunately. So Sir Thomas More was actually doing kind of a funny at that point, but really people have after utopia for many years, but not much has happened. So utopias have been economic, political, scientific, technological, religious, and in my case, sexual. And over the years, between 1855 and 1955, there were 15 utopias in California, 15 of them. Sonoma County, there were 4. Does anyone know any other utopias in California in that period of time? In Sonoma County? Sonoma County? No one. Okay. Has anyone ever seen a road up on Fountain Grove called Altruria? Altruria? Altruria was a utopian community. Anybody ever seen a town above Cloverdale called Preston? You know about Preston? Preston was a utopian community. Then there was also one called Icaria Speranza, which was available in the Cloverdale area for a little bit of time. But let me talk about those. The Preston community was the longest lasting. And Madam Preston, with the blessing of her husband, who was a doctor, he kind of humored her. She was into medical issues, a good diet, and communication with God. And in 1886, she established Preston, a utopian community about 2 miles north of Cloverdale. And at one point, by the highest point of its existence in about 1895, they had 150 people living there. And they had in Preston at that point, they had a depot for the train, a store, a planing mill, a school, a stable, a church, and a spring water production mill. And it went on until 1909 when Madam Preston died. And then it disappeared, although the building stayed there. And back in hippie times, in 1977 to 1988, a hippie commune took over Preston and did also a utopia there for them. Unfortunately, a big fire in 1988 destroyed most of the buildings of Preston, and that particular utopian community disappeared. Now let's talk about Altruria. Now Altruria was a Christian socialist utopia established in 1892, and they bought 105 acres along Marquette Spring Road. And they decided they would move in the fall, and they were going to build a big kind of a hotel where they would stay in a communal operation. So they started in the fall. It was operated by a minister whose name was Edward Payne out of Berkeley. So about 26 to 40 people moved in and started construction on their hotel home. And that was in October. So the rains came, the cold came in, they were living in tents. They had the building half done. And by June, the utopian community disbanded because they couldn't stand each other any longer, according to what they said. So that building was completed and became Dr. Sprague's Sanitarium in days after that. And then there was the Icarius Speranzo Utopia, which existed from 1881 to 1886, founded on writing by a man named Cadet, communal agriculture, and existed up there for a while. So those are the ones that were there before I got into this situation. I probably ought to tell you a little bit about myself because you may have heard some bad things about me. Does anybody have a negative impression of Thomas Lake Harris? Nobody knows anything about me? Nobody knows anything about me? I was the most incredible guy. I never did anything wrong. It was just fantastic. Actually, some people have a bad impression of me because of things that happened and things that got out. And there was that woman, Alzire Chevalier. She was a reporter, believe it or not, back in the 1890s. And she went around and that was after good stories. So back then I invited her to come to the Brotherhood of New Life, thinking that she could tell folks what we were up to and praise us for what we were doing. And she came in, she stayed with us for a couple days, and then she went out and she wrote the most incredibly awful, sleazy article about me. I couldn't believe what she said. I'll tell you about that a little bit later. But she tried to get the Santa Rosa Press Democrat to publish the story. They wouldn't have anything to do with it because I was an important guy in town back then. However, then she went over on the ferry to San Francisco to the Chronicle. And guess what they did? It was all over the place. So, but I'll get a little more into that in a little bit. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I was born in England of a very poor family. But they knew as soon as I was of an age that I was something special because I had this ability to convince people of things that maybe they didn't want to be convinced of. As I grew, I became quite tall and quite handsome with these riveting, penetrating eyes, exactly. And we came to the United States when I was just a boy and stayed here for the first 20 years of my life. And during that time, I was able to go to school. I went to 1 year of college. And by the time I was 20 years old, I was a Universalist minister. And at that point, I got exposed to communal living. We had a small commune in Virginia, which kind of failed too. So then I went back to England. And in England, I got exposed to Swedenborgian socialism. Any Swedenborgians here? No Swedenborgians? It still exists. Swedenborgians basically believe that there's spirits everywhere and people can move into others' bodies through spiritual contact. And it was very popular. It's still around. So I got into that, but I thought that was a little tame. So I began to come up with my own particular versions of a spiritual religion. And ultimately, I had 60 followers in England, and we moved to New York in 1860 and started my first colony, my colony that was called the Brotherhood of New Life. Any members of the Brotherhood here? None? No sisterhoods, brotherhoods? Anyway, we started the Brotherhood of New Life up in Brockton, New York in 1860. And by the time we moved out of there in 1875, we had 2,000 followers. Besides being a spiritualist and a minister, I was also an author. I wrote poetry. Most people said they could never understand anything that was in my poetry, but that was sour grapes because it was really good. And then I also put out tracts, of course, to encourage people to join with our brotherhood. And 2,000 people were on the mailing list by 1875. But now I probably ought to tell you, since you're probably all here to consider joining the brotherhood, I probably ought to tell you what the criteria are for joining the brotherhood. Now, these are very important. You may want to take notes because you want to think about this. Okay, the Brotherhood of New Life, in order to become a brother or a sister in the Brotherhood of New Life, you have to give me all your wealth. Number one. Okay. And I do good things with it. I just don't use it. Forget all that stuff that they said about my being greedy. That's the first thing you got to do. You got to call me divine, because I am divine. So you got to call me either the father, the primate, the pivot, or the king, any one of those titles. You've got to begin to practice spiritual breathing. We have breathing systems which will get you into with the divine and with the other spirits that are out there. And then the final thing is your counterparts. You know, every one of you has a counterpart in the celestial sphere. Some people call that heaven, some people call it the celestial sphere. So that counterpart is waiting for you. And that counterpart does not want you to be sullied before you get there. So therefore, here on this earth, you are to have no carnal knowledge of any other human being, because you're going to save yourself for the celestial sphere. Have I convinced anybody so far to join this group? How many people are interested? We can talk afterward. I saw one back there. Now, I might mention there is an exception to that carnal knowledge thing, and that's very specific, and it applies generally to women. And women who are, fantastic spiritualists and really please me a lot. If they please me really a lot, then I have the ability to channel the spirit partner that you have in the celestial sphere into my body. So there's the exception to the carnal knowledge. So, so you probably get what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's mostly for women, almost always for women is the way it is anyway. Okay, so, okay. No, it's interesting. When we were in New York, I've traveled back and forth to England a lot. And at that point, I came across a man named Lawrence Oliphant. Anybody ever heard of Lawrence Oliphant? He was an author back in those days. He was a member of the Houses of Parliament. He was of a noble stock. His wife was extremely wealthy. He became one of my devotees, believe it or not, and his wife then would proceed to sell her jewelry so that we could have more things for the colony, of course, not for me. But anyway, while he was there, he happened to come across a group of Japanese young men in England, which I'll tell you a little more about later. But at one time, these Japanese young men, convinced by Oliphant to join us, some of those Japanese young men came to New York and joined our colony. So we had this nice colony in New York. And then I was reading the California magazine in 1874. And because up in New York, we decided that a crop that we'd want to grow, we were agriculture, of course, was grapes to produce wine. And now some members of the group were a little bit upset about that because they thought we should maybe be more teetotalers in those days. But I did some research and convinced them that that our wine was special. It's another exception to the teetotaler. I said, my body has been, whoops, wrong one. That's my okay. Okay, here it is. Oh, wine prepared by me was fulfilled with divine breath. All noxious influences are neutralized. So therefore, we were allowed to produce wine. Okay. So then I'm reading this California magazine, and it says the best place in all the world to produce wine, because we're having trouble there in New York, as you can understand, is California, Sonoma County, California. So guess what we did next? We all got on a train. There were about 50 of us in the first group that came here. And we come and we look around and we find land. We got a real estate agent And the real estate agent said, well, we got that land up there on that hill. There's not much up there, but you might be interested. So we bought first 400 acres, then leased more 400 more. Ultimately, we had 1,600 acres, and we called it, guess what we called it? Fountain Grove, the Brotherhood of New Life, up there on the hill, right here, right. Your utopia was right here in Santa Rosa, up there on the hill. Can you believe that? Okay, and in we came, and we started work on our winery because wine was going to be a big issue. And then, of course, we had to have also the quarters for the acolytes, my acolytes. The first quarter was the commandery. That was the big house, and that was 3 stories tall. It was a French provincial Victorian up there on the top of the hill. Until about 2 years ago, some of the gardens and trees from that house were still in existence before it was bulldozed or whatever. Then we had, of course, the barracks, 3-story barracks for the men. And then we had the cottages for the women. And then we had all the outbuildings for production of wine and things of that sort. And we started wine production. And we also had the services of a Dr. John Hyde, who in those days was the biggest expert on winemaking in the United States. He came with us. He was one of the acolytes. And he actually managed to get us through some hard times because you may have heard of phylloxera. That's a disease that affects wine grapes. And he anticipated that and had us use rootstock from the native California grapes for our wine. So when the phylloxera hit all the other wineries around here, we were still going strong. And by the year 1890, we actually exported to 200,000 gallons of wine to the rest of the world. And here is one of our later containers of the wine that was loose. This is actually for pure wine grape juice. And that was useful during the Prohibition, because you couldn't sell wine during Prohibition, but you could sell pure wine grape juice, which if you left stand a while and added a few things to it, would kind of turn into something that resembled wine. Of course, I was gone elsewhere by then, but I understood that this all happened. Okay, so here we are. By the way, I called the manor house Estivosa. Commandery, I call it Estivosa. Anybody know what that means? No, that's in a language that only I can understand. So it means high country of divine joy. High country of divine joy. And the theory of my colony at that point, some people had the nerve to call us a cult. Can you believe that? Anyway, the theory was that as we all went into the celestial sphere, that all the buildings up there would go up into that celestial sphere. So the buildings are indeed all gone. So maybe they're in the celestial sphere. We're not quite sure about that point. Let's see. And everything was going real well out there. I had a young man, I mentioned about the Japanese students. I had a young man named Kanaye Nagasawa, who was part of my group of leaders of the colony up there. And he was kind of my second in charge. And he learned from Dr. Hyde how to produce the most fantastic wines in the area. For example, here we have gold medals from for Fountain Grove, Sonoma County, Mountains Infidel, Sonoma Semi-Leone. These are 1946 like vintages. Of course, I was not gone by then, but they were still producing up there. So, okay, so we're doing really well up there. We have good relations with the city of Santa Rosa. We're always in the newspaper. They're talking about all the good things we do. And the rumors circulate, but you know how rumors circulate. Most of them you can't pay any attention to. But then, oh, by the way, our wine, we had sales outlets all over the country. We had small colonies all over. So we were exporting our wine all over the world in the 1870s and 80s. So we were doing quite well out there. The money was rolling in. I was able to furnish the commandery in antiques and rare rugs. And it was, of course, to the benefit of everybody, because anybody could come by and look in. I let them peek in periodically. And then, of course, I had the staff in the commandery. They were mostly female. But anyway, So everything was going really well until Madame Alzire Chevalier. Anybody ever heard of her? Good. She should be forgotten. So she comes in, I invite her in, as I mentioned, so that we could have a good article in the paper about what we were doing up there and our wine and how we lived and things like that. And so she agreed to come over and interview me and stay for a couple days. Now, I do admit that when she first showed up, when I met her in the office, that my secretary had her feet on my lap. And that was kind of a bad start. And then I probably should not, after that, have kind of come on so strong to her. I mean, she was clearly offended, I thought. But she stayed up there a couple of days and then she left. And I thought we were in good shape. But then she came down somewhere in Santa Rosa, wrote up a series of articles and tried to sell them to the Sonoma Democrat in those days. Sonoma Democrat said, you're slandering one of the big men in Santa Rosa. Thomas Lake Harris was part of every club and really doing good stuff. We can't publish this. So as I mentioned, she got on the ferry to San Francisco and went to the Chronicle and presented their stuff. And they were always, they're always after slandering the country town, Santa Rosa and such. So they published everything. And she not only just did that from our little discussion with her, but she went out and interviewed people that had left the colony. We had always had soreheads that left the colony. She went and searched them all out, and she got affidavits from them alleging the things that happened up there, which I know you will not believe ever happened. Would I ever put anybody in solitary confinement for disobeying my rules? Would that ever happen? I would never do. You can't see that, can you? You cannot see that at all. And then she actually got into, of course, in those days in the newspaper, you couldn't write explicit sexual information, but she had all kinds of implications about sexual stuff happening up there at Fountain Grove. Can you believe that? And they actually made it a series, not just one article. It was like in every Sunday for a couple of weeks. So it was all out there. And people were saying now, oh, I heard rumors about stuff happening up there. And I heard rumors about this and that. And so I decided that for the good of the colony, I probably better leave. So at that point, I had mastered human resuscitation. This is 1891. I had mastered it. So I told all my followers that I was going to go back to New York where I could really deal further with the human resuscitation thing. So in 1891, I took the train and went back to New York. And there I continued in the New York colony for a while. And then in 1906, I decided it was time to move on the celestial sphere. So some of my followers saw that I appeared to be dead, but they thought, of course, that I was just sleeping. So they kept my body in that form for 3 months as they waited for me to wake up. And not waking up because I didn't want to, of course. At that point, they actually put me in the ground. That was unfortunate. That was just a mistake. But anyway. So I've been moving back and forth between the celestial sphere and life ever since that time. But now you're probably wondering, well, what happened to the Fountain Grove colony once I was gone? Now, we did have a group of like 4 board of directors of the colony. And one of them was this young man named Kanai Nagasawa. And they all took over, but once I was gone, kind of the spiritual nature of the colony disappeared. So 3 of the board of directors kind of disappeared. And the rules said that anyone still living on the property who was a member of the original Brotherhood of New Life would acquire the entire property. So Kanaye Nagasawa in 1906, a few years later, acquired the entire property and kept up the production of wine. Now, how on earth did this young man born in Japan in 1853 get here and to get to know so much about wine? So let's talk a little bit about Kanai Nagasawa, born in 1853. And his real name was Hikosoki Isunaga. And he was a member of the Satsumi clan from Kagoshima. He was a member of a samurai family. And the leader of the Satsuma clan rather, decided in the 1860s that Japan was too backward and they needed education in order to join the modern world. Now, the Meiji Emperor of Japan didn't want that to happen. Nobody leaves, nobody comes in except for a very limited basis. So my leader of the clan contacted 15 young men and their parents and agreed that we would sneak out of Japan and we'd go to Europe and learn engineering and all kinds of things that would be useful for the future empire of Japan. It was called the Satsuma 15. And I was the youngest. I was 13 when we left Japan. And because we were leaving and we thought perhaps we'd be captured and executed on the way out, we changed our names. I became Kanaye Nagasawa. Kanaye Nagasawa. No emphasis anywhere. Kanaye Nagasawa. And wrote my mother my death poem. And I cut my hair. And then we got on a steamer. We sneaked onto a steamer that was going to Hong Kong. We got into Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong, we made ourselves across to Europe, and almost all of us went into England. And I was assigned as the youngest to a school in Scotland. So here's a young Japanese boy. I was 13 years old at the point in Scotland, learning English. So for the rest of my life, I spoke English with a Scotch accent. So that was a little bit different too. So, okay. So this is going on. I'm still quite young. I'm in high school, but I'm staying there for a couple of years. The rest of the 15, many of them were in college and they went back. And by the way, most of them became dignitaries in Japan. They were ministers, military leaders, and things like that. Only two of us never went back. One passed on. I was the other one to stay. So let's see. So while I was there in Scotland, I met Lawrence Oliphant, and he took me to London at one point, and there was Thomas Lake Harris talking about his philosophy and what he was doing with agriculture and being in the United States. And I was ready to do something different, so I joined up. So I went to Broxton, New York with Thomas Lake Harris, worked with Dr. Hyde, became an expert in wine. And when they all got on the train to come to Santa Rosa, California in 1875, I was there. So I became, Dr. Hyde didn't stay with us very long, because I became the expert winemaker here in Sonoma. And while I was here, of course, I worked under Thomas Lake Harris. I was kind of an acolyte. I sort of accepted some of the stuff he said, but I was mostly interested in agriculture. So while we're here, we built up the wine production here, and I brought over lots of people from Japan to help with the wine production. At one point, we had 10 to 15 Japanese Americans working here, and some of them are buried in the Santa Rosa Rural Cemetery to this point. So everything was under Thomas Lake Harris until 1891, and when he moved out, and as time went by, I became the director of the Fountain Grove colony, which was no longer a religious colony. It was kind of a communal thing. And ultimately, it was no longer communal. It was actually ultimately my thing and employees. And I became then kind of a different person. I was then known as the Japanese Baron of Fountain Grove, because how many other Japanese Americans, there weren't hardly any in California at that point, but how many had a great mansion up on the hill? And the consulate in San Francisco needed a place for entertaining people that came from Asia. So anybody that came from Asia to San Francisco was always told to go to Sonoma and visit up there on the hill to the Brotherhood, and we'd entertain. So people from all over Japan came to us, and we got wealthier and wealthier. And I was a little bit eccentric, I guess you'd have to say, or he was, I'm sorry, I guess I was a little bit eccentric, because he always liked to dress every day in a black suit with a bowler hat. And he liked to be driven around the estate in a Buick touring car, open Buick touring car, driven by an African-American chauffeur who always wore white gloves. So it was kind of interesting for people to see. But once I got to where the workers were, I'd get out there, even in my suit, and I'd show them how to prune the grapes and do this and do that, and all the other things. So everything went really well from that period. And I became the big man up there and the big man in Santa Rosa until, what, 1934. And then I died at the age of 81. So obviously I had all this property, all this money, and I had a niece and a nephew. So obviously I left it all to them. So, which is what I did. However, this was the time when the tensions between Japan and the United States were building. There were all kinds of rules about what property could be passed on. And by the time that the Fountain Grove Ranch was sold for $165,000 in 1934, and all the money went to Santa Rosa taxes and state taxes and to the lawyers and all that kind of stuff. Each one of my niece and my nephew each got $4,000. So that's what was left. Now, what happened else there? The person that bought the estate for the next 20 years produced wine, and the quality was still good, as you can see from some of the plaques. But then in 1955, the wine business was down. And I forgot something I mentioned. One of the things that I built, especially during the period that I was in charge in 1891, was that round barn. Remember the Fountain Grove round barn? That was mine, 1891. And I understand you guys sent it up to the Celestial Sphere in 2017, unfortunately. The big house, which I lived in until I passed on, and others lived in there, it was partially burned, then torn down in 1970. The barracks for the men and the cottage for the women all disappeared at some point, not sure. All the winery buildings, once the wine disappeared, they stayed there until a couple of years ago. Anybody remember seeing those up there? The tumble down winery buildings that were up there. Well, everything's gone. There's not one shred of Fountain Grove left at this point. Even the gardens and some of the trees that I planted way back are all gone, unfortunately. So, okay, so there we are. The 1955, it sells, it becomes a cattle ranch. And at that point, they put the lake in. That lake was not there when I was active, either as Thomas Lake Harris or Kanae Nagasawa. And then, of course, it becomes a housing development. So as the housing development is put in, developers in the city are allowed to suggest names for roads. And one of the most fantastic road naming, this is off the subject, is Franz Kafka Way. Has anybody ever been on Franz Kafka Way? Does anybody know the author Franz Kafka? Okay, Franz Kafka wrote stories where he was in the middle of some kind of a mess. He didn't understand what he was there for, why he was there, what he had done, but he was there. So the developer of the buildings along Franz Kafka Way apparently went into a similar mess with the city planning department. So when they asked him what he wanted to name his road, he tongue-in-cheek suggested Franz Kafka Way. Nobody in the planning department knew what that meant. So we now have Franz Kafka Way in Santa Rosa. So the same thing happened up on Fountain Grove. What do you want to name your road? And they looked through the books and said, well, this was the Brotherhood of New Life, and Thomas Lake Harris was in charge of that thing. And a lot of people speak well of him. Why don't we name it Thomas Lake Harris Boulevard? So that's what you got there now. So, and I like that because I think I deserve a lot of credit and a lot of honor. Do you not all? There was a move at one point to change the name to something else, but I think I'm glad you kept it for me. But the problem was among some people, I didn't particularly resent it, but other people felt that Kanae Nagasawa was the real hero of this story. And there we were with Thomas Lake Harris Way and Fountain Grove this and Fountain Grove, no mention of Kanae Nagasawa. So in 1996, the Japanese American Citizen League got together with the Santa Rosa Board of Community Services and proposed renaming something after Kanae Nagasawa. And what had been Fountain Grove Community Park is now Kanae Nagasawa Community Park at Fountain Grove. So he got some credit, but of course I got most of it. Okay. So, okay, that's what I pretty much have to tell you about. Are there any questions? Okay. No questions? Nobody wants to look at the paperwork for signing up for the colony?
Any
Question?
questions?
Question?
Questions? Yeah.
How did I discover what?
Information.
Well, I lived it. I am him. Of course, I remember it all. I remember it all perfectly. Is that a good answer to your question? Okay, thank you. Any other?
How long did it take to get from San Francisco up to the top of Fountain Grove to stay in your home for a couple months?
How long would it take?
Yeah.
Well, in those days, we actually had what was called the triangle system. You could get on a ferry in San Francisco, ferry over to Sausalito. You could get on a train. The train would stop at the depot in Santa Rosa. You'd get a stagecoach or whatever, and up you'd go. So you could do it in probably 5-6 hours. Wasn't bad at all. And then that, by the way, that triangle route would continue up to Fulton, then it would go west all the way to Duncan's Mills, ultimately, and then south through the county into Marin County, and then back to Sausalito. So you technically could have done the whole route in one day, like in 14 hours, if you timed it right. Any others? And so I'll have do I have a little room available somewhere where I can meet with prospective members of the Brotherhood?
Absolutely.
Okay, small room somewhere.
So I'll ask the question that you didn't answer. How did Bill Montgomery learn all this information?
Well, that guy? Okay, well, that's a long story. But Bill Montgomery was always kind of interested in history when he was a little kid, and liked to visit cemeteries. So when Bill Montgomery got the job as the deputy director of Parks for Santa Rosa, after a year or two, he was stunned to understand that he was in charge of the historical properties in Santa Rosa, the Church of One Tree, the Burbank Home and Gardens, and the rural cemetery, which he at that point had never seen. So he went to see the rural cemetery, and in 1990, the rural cemetery was a disaster. The city had acquired it in 79 from private developers, but it was completely overgrown, a complete mess. City had even burned it over a couple times just to get rid of the debris. And it was a complete mess. So he got involved, Bill Montgomery got involved in what can we do about the cemetery? And we came up with a volunteer project. And part of that volunteer project was starting to do tours of the cemetery and explore Santa Rosa history through tours of the cemetery. So that was kind of the genesis of his stuff. Okay, anybody else?
Is there a special section for the Japanese that were the original Japanese that were here in the rural cemetery?
There was never a formal section, but it appears, and we're not sure of the history, that the Japanese Americans who were here bought a section where there's about 30 Japanese Americans buried there. Then there's a few others scattered around the cemetery. And that's interesting because until 1930, no Chinese at all could be buried in the cemetery because you don't want celestials in your cemetery. You know that, of course, you don't want that. So, but the Japanese were allowed, and there's 37 buried there now. Last burial was in the 40s. And after that, I think all Japanese burials went to Petaluma, where there's a Japanese section. Japanese American Citizen League still helps take care of the cemetery. Okay.
I have another question. During the roundup of the Japanese World War II, were the Santa Rosa Japanese also rounded up?
Indeed they were. They were all rounded up, but and they were taken to which camp? The Colorado camp, I believe they were most of this area of California Japanese. But the good news is that people in Sonoma County protected their assets. The sheriff was behind the move to protect their assets, so people's property was protected, their crops were protected, their pets were saved. And when they came back, most Japanese in Sonoma County were able to go back to their normal life after 4 years. So we did really good. Okay.
Would you recommend Gay LeBaron's book that
Oh.
tells about Fountain Grove?
Absolutely. Oh, her Fountain Grove book, sure, absolutely. I'd recommend all her books. In fact, those of us who do historic research start with Gayla Barron books. She is Santa Rosa, a 19th century town, and Santa Rosa, 20th century town. Half the time, anything you're looking for, you can find in there without further research. It's amazing. And then she's written a book of the Promise Keeper, Pleasure Seekers, just about Fountain Grove. It talks about Lawrence Oliphant and all the things that happened up there, and my various wives. I had 3 wives, and I had a couple kids. A couple are buried in the rural cemetery. I was busy.
Well, what an entertaining talk.
Yeah.
Thank you so
So-
very much.
So the little room in here, is that the little room where I'll meet with?
Sure,
Okay.
sure.